The axe is about to fall on education funding in Ontario. Next Wednesday, the Harris government will unveil a financial statement which is expected to outline a series of unprecedented spending cuts. Some reports say more than $3 billion will be slashed. And this time, one of the targets will be education spending. I'm George Clark. Welcome to Inquiry. Post-secondary institutions are bracing for cuts of up to 30% over the next 2 years. But how will that affect the quality of education? And how will it affect the jobs of staff and faculty? Tonight, we'll discuss the implications. Joining us is the former Minister of Colleges and Universities, Dr. Harry Parrott of Woodstockton. Dr. Parrott, you say the Harris government really has no choice but to bring down the axe.
That's absolutely correct. As a former student, as a former faculty member, a former minister, I probably would find it very painful, very difficult, and maybe even not agree. But quite frankly, as a citizen, and looking at the broad picture, if the deficit isn't controlled and the debt eliminated, the other side of that coin is so horrendous, I don't even want to look at it. So there is no choice.
All right, thank you. Greg Moran is Vice President Academic at the University of Western Ontario. And Dr. Moran, is there any way to absorb these cuts without laying off staff or faculty?
No, absolutely not. The scale of the cuts that we're looking at are unprecedented. And there's no doubt that the cuts that if the cuts come through at the levels that we're now talking about and have been led to believe, then we're definitely going to see layoffs, and we're going to have an impact on the quality of what we do at the university, although we certainly will do our best to minimize that impact.
All right, thank you. Also with us is Jim Montag, the chair of the London and Middlesex Taxpayers Coalition. And Mr. Montag, you're a long-time opponent of tax increases at all levels of government. Do you think this cutting is long overdue?
Yes, I do. Ontario here faces a combined debt of over $140 billion. When you look at this, this is greater than the national debt of almost all but 7% of the sovereign nations in the world. We all have to harsh realities, and I don't know why the education industry should be treated any differently than the rest of us.
All right, thank you. Rahim Rajpar is Vice President of the University of Western Ontario Students' Council, responsible for student issues. And Mr. Rajpar, do you feel that there should be special treatment given to education at this time?
Well, I really see that education is a special category because of the benefits it gives the rest of society. If you take a look at some of the impacts that post-secondary education can give society and the economic benefits that post-secondary education gives to society, I think, we'd be foolish to say that it doesn't benefit society in a special way.
Can certain sectors be given special status when the government is looking at huge cuts to its spending programs?
I don't believe in that. I believe in equality for everyone, special status for no one. And that includes just about every situation we could come into in this world.
I think that the point is well taken, that the debt is a serious problem, but I would ask you to think about the issue of across-the-board equal cuts, and maybe ask yourself that if you were going to take a 50 or 20% cut in your income in your family, whether you would cut all elements of the family income in the same way. Would you cut what you spend on food and clothing your children at the same amount that you'd cut on holidays?
If it were my family income that were being cut, I would prioritize. Definitely. Absolutely. I would cut holidays first, and I would cut food last, and housing last.
And I think that that's probably what I would like some more reassurance from this government, that they're actually doing that they're thinking about the priorities, thinking about the level of funding that currently exists in the public sector, and making those decisions, the tough decisions, on a selective basis. I think that that's part of what the job of government is to do, even though we acknowledge that the cutbacks have to happen.
I think we should all have sort of an equal cutback and let us individually prioritize how we're going to do this.
But there's no doubt that as you sit around that cabinet table, that's exactly what will happen. They will try to establish some priorities, and I've lived through a few of those, not to this degree cutback, but the discussion that goes on at cabinet is pretty real and pretty intense, so that there is a priority established on the funding cuts. And I'd be amazed if that doesn't happen this time.
Well, I'd like to pick up on something that Rahim said before, is is, you know, I don't want to argue at all, and I'd like to start to begin with by saying that I think that universities at the post-secondary sector does have to look at the way that it runs its house and be more effective, be more efficient. But just a little anecdote that Japan, and as we know, I think it's a government that is known for, I think, wise budgeting, for wise planning. At the same time that they're facing the same kinds of recession problems that we are in the rest of the industrialized world, they've made a commitment to increase their investment in research and development and higher education. And I think that was done in the face of major cutbacks in other areas. And I think it was done for exactly the reason that Rahim suggested, that we've got to be extremely careful about the extent to which we damage what is a very valuable and vulnerable resource that is a vital element of the future social and economic welfare of the province. Again, not saying that we shouldn't be cut and that it isn't going to be difficult no matter what size of a cut we take. But I really do think, that, and I hope that Dr. Parrott is right, and that those kinds of deliberations are going around the cabinet table, and people are thinking very carefully about the relative impact of the cuts in the various sectors.
But you did mention that they are spending this money on research and development. Well, this is prioritizing a situation. Undoubtedly, they've cut back in other areas, and I think this is what should happen here. We should look at our post-secondary education system and see what is most important and try to leave that intact. But
absolutely,
there are many aspects of the secondary education system that are not at all important, and they're turning out graduates by the thousands every year. That's where the cuts should be. Now, but this is up to the university to decide. I think the government should just flatly come out and say, this is so much for you, so much for you, so much for you, and try to be fair and equal to everybody.
Do the students accept that they'll have to face an increase in tuition, and perhaps they should?
Well, coming from the student's perspective, I mean, we're not going to sit here and say we don't, you know, deserve tuition hikes, or we don't see a need for some cuts to universities. That would be foolish, and that's not the position that we're taking. What we are taking, and what the position we are saying, is that it's very necessary for this government to prioritize and to plan for the future, which we simply do not believe the current government is doing. If you take a look at some of the decisions that might be coming down, the impacts of these decisions hasn't been fully thought out. You know, the government is, in January, will be releasing a white paper on university restructuring. Why announce the funding cuts and then provide the infrastructure for restructuring? I don't really necessarily think the order in which things are happening are necessarily the correct order. You mentioned you have to prioritize and you have to maintain what you want to see in a system. Ultimately, I'd like to see a system that's truly accessible. And currently, the government has no plans, in my opinion, that's going to make a system accessible.
By accessible, do you mean accessible to everybody? Is this universality that you're talking about, or?
It's the opinion of myself and many students that post-secondary education should be accessible to those who academically qualify.
Well, there is no universality in secondary education in any country in the world, including Russia. It was only the best students that were granted higher education.
Right, but is it necessarily the best students or the people who can afford to go? And I'm saying that there should be an academic component in admissions, but there should not be a financial component, that if you cannot afford to go, the government should help you go.
Perhaps.
I think they do that already.
Perhaps when we return after these commercials, we can discuss what type of measures are being planned to accommodate what we all know are cuts, just not the size of, when we return after this. We went to commercial. I suggested that perhaps we would discuss what kind of planning is taking place now to deal with the cuts, because we know they're coming.
I think there's another factor in this particular system that should be recognized. There's a lot of autonomy to the colleges and the universities in particular, that they are able to do some planning on their own without government interference. I feel very strongly that that should be maintained. We don't want the government setting all the priorities for the system. And I say to Jim, maybe we've got to look at that group of people to do the hard planning. I can think of some terribly difficult decisions that might be made, closing of faculties, and that can only be done if the system within itself looks at the priorities.
Dr. Moran, obviously everyone's known something like this has been coming for several months now, since the election itself. The university is dealing with this already?
No, I think that certainly at Western, we, the president, Paul Davenport, and I have been right from the beginning of September, I think, aware of the sorts of cuts that the government was planning, and we've tried to begin our planning internally and making the kind of, I think, what are going to be difficult selective decisions as early as possible. Now, what we did was put a hiring freeze on all staff and faculty positions at the beginning of September, just to provide the kind of flexibility that we're going to need to make the kind of cuts that I think we're facing in the next
But I was thinking more particularly of the relationship between Western and Toronto and Wilfrid Laurier, the many institutions that we have, what, 22 colleges and what?
Yeah, and we're going to have to be working more together, talking to one another about the possibility of focusing more in particular areas. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think that's becoming more widely recognized within the university sector, and that you will, over the next few years, see the kinds of changes that you're talking about.
And there is a mechanism for that to be done.
Well, the mechanism is the autonomy that you've spoken of, that autonomy is very important. You're right that we do have the individual autonomy, the power, the authority to do that. The difficulty is, and you're aware of this, Dr. Parrott, that there are other constraints on us that we need some greater flexibility in. You say that we have the autonomy, and we do it at least in principle, but our enrollment is controlled by our grants. If we reduce our enrollment, then our grants will fall even further. Tuition is tightly controlled by Toronto. We have no freedom to increase our tuition in programs that are more costly or in higher demand or of greater personal financial benefit to individual students. We need that autonomy in order to make the kinds of changes that you're talking about. And those kinds of constraints make the kinds of changes you're talking about much more difficult.
And that's an area where I think a good deal of lobbying should occur.
Absolutely.
You know, I'd support that kind of autonomy.
And I appreciate that. I think what the universities are saying through the Council of Ontario Universities to the government is, look, if you want us to get our house in order and to manage our affairs in the kinds of ways we've been talking about here, then give us a little more rope. Give us some ability to do this. Not rope to hang ourselves with, but rope to do the job for the province that you'd all like us to do.
There has been a suggestion that there will be perhaps deregulation of tuition fees coming down at the same time as the cuts are announced.
That's right.
Is that enough of a solution to give the universities and colleges room to move?
Why don't you go ahead.
Thank you. Deregulation, there are benefits to it and there are disadvantages to it. And where the students stand at Western and where we stand provincially and what we've been lobbying for is that a study be done. And the government said, yes, they're going to be looking at this and looking at the impacts of this. And this will be coming out in January. The full impacts of deregulation have not been realized by anyone. No one's looked into this. And what we're asking is that before you make these funding cuts and before you make this funding announcement, make sure you realize as a government what you're going to be doing to this sector, because you don't know at this point in time, and nobody does know. And that's what we'd like to see, that perhaps postpone this funding announcement and do further research into the area. And when you're putting out your white paper in January, talk about the impacts of deregulation, and that's what we're lobbying for.
With the knowledge that obviously the cuts are not going to be delayed, they are coming down on Wednesday, where does this leave students? What can they do about what's going on?
Well, traditionally students have always been regarded as a very apathetic bunch and a very easy group to target when it comes to funding cuts because you know, we're tied up in our own lives, the perception goes, and we don't really care. And that's simply not true because this year we mounted a campaign against the current government and the proposed funding cuts. And from Western alone, we had over 4,000 postcards sent to the Minister of Education. We've also held a number of press conferences, putting our stance forward. We've held a number of debates, and students are really talking about the cuts. So one of the greatest things we've achieved through this process is to make our students more politically aware and letting them care more about the system. In terms of what students can do, really talk to your MPPs and talk to the minister. That's about all you can do. We don't really have too much power at that point. One of the nice things of belonging to a provincial advocacy group is that a lot of that is done for us through USA, the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance. And USA's been very successful in achieving that.
The campaigns that you've mounted, and it's not your field particularly, there's also the fields of medicine, the fields of social assistance, as the cuts are being felt across the province. Polls just this last week showed that 58% of the people favor what the government is doing so far. Jim, you still think it's the right way?
We don't want to forget that this government started out at about 20% going into the election, and they ended up with the highs, 30% at the end of the election, and now it's 58%. Now, this is the great silent majority out there that is saying, yes, we agree with what this government is doing. Now, you mentioned a protest movement. Now, everybody that faces a cut is going to protest and protest and protest. Now, this is a NIMBY situation, not in my backyard. Don't cut me, cut him.
No, I don't necessarily think students are saying that. No,
everybody has to be cut.
I don't think students and universities are saying that at all. I think what we're calling for
you're
is
protesting the cut.
We're protesting the way the cuts are happening.
So did the social service people protest the cut. So are the medical profession going to protest the cut.
Well, what would you rather have us, sit back and take the cuts quietly? No, I mean, that's not an appropriate thing for us to do.
We all have to do this. This is a terrible situation that Ontario is in. I don't want to see Ontario or Canada go bankrupt, but we will, unless we have cuts like this. I want to face these cuts, just like you are. Everybody has to be treated equally, and everybody has to face this.
One of the most important things that I've learned over this process is that the economic impacts and benefits that post-secondary education provides, the research and technical development that our institutions provide for society are far greater than any other sector. And there was a study done that said that for every dollar that you put into post-secondary education, you get $4 back on return into the economy.
We have studies that show one thing and another study that shows the opposite.
But you can't disagree that post-secondary education has...
I've read too many of these studies to place a lot of credibility with any of them.
I wonder if I could add anything to this debate, and I think point out that what I think Rahim and I are saying is not that the cuts don't have to come, but that we do want to make sure that the government is doing the kind of thinking that Dr. Parrott suggested earlier.
Well, I would agree
and if I
with
could
that,
just bring up the relative, one of the things you might want to ask is what is the relative level of resources in the various sectors before we start? Yeah. In Ontario, universities are funded at a level 9th out of 10 provinces per student relative to the rest of Canada. In the areas of municipality funding, hospitals, and the public school system, we are first or second. Universities in Ontario are now funded 9th after all of the cuts that we've heard about in Alberta, and a 21% cut in funding to universities in Alberta. They are 6th. We are 9th before we start facing the cuts next year. So those are factors that I think the government, and I hope the government, is thinking about, because just as we talked about our personal incomes before, if I'm already at a level where I'm not investing a lot of money in my children's clothing, and another family is in a situation in which they've been extravagant with buying clothing for their children, well, then they should hit the clothing first. In this province and in my family, if my kids have barely got enough, the right kind of clothes to wear, well, I better think twice before I hit that area. And I think that that's the kind of information that we want to get out in the public and want the government to make sure they're looking at.
When we return after these commercials, perhaps we can discuss whether these cuts that are being contemplated, will they actually deny anyone an opportunity to attend a college or university in Ontario after this? Just before we went to commercial, I posed the question, will the cuts that we understand that are coming, will that actually deny anyone an opportunity to go to a college or a university in Ontario? Do you think?
Not if the universities have anything to say about it. I think that it's clear that we have to take a greater responsibility, and we have to be accountable for ensuring that there are good loan programs in place that people can use and don't cause a terrible burden on them, and also that we work on scholarships and bursaries. If we do see deregulation, we have to make a commitment to ensuring that some part of that is made available, particularly to students who, as Rahim suggested before, might not have the wherewithal, but do have the qualifications to go to university.
Mm-hmm. I wish I could be that optimistic. I'm not at this point in time. We all know that there's a lot of problems with the loan system as it exists right now, and the government has promised to study or to look into this, to revamping the loan system. The ultimate goal of a loan system is to maintain a level of accessibility. And what the government is now saying is that they're going to come out with an income contingent loan repayment program plan in '97, 2 years after the funding cuts are announced, and the effects of these cuts will already be felt. So for about 2 years, what's going to happen is that we're not going to have any mechanisms in place to maintain that accessibility. So students who cannot afford to go will not be able to go. And that's just because the government is not prioritizing and is not fully thinking through the cuts that they're making.
I have to worry about that a little bit. I know I'm from a generation much removed, but the difference between your generation and alone and mine was that I had to go to the private sector. I had to go to my family friend and say, here, I need some money. I was born in a wonderful but not wealthy home. And it was a friend of the family. So it's much easier today to sign a piece of paper that is guaranteed by the government and administered by the bank than it was that direct approach to a family friend. So we've always faced the need of loans as young people.
But to be fair, Dr. Parrott, I think that you would probably also agree that when you were at university that there were people who were unable to get into university because they couldn't find those loans and find that money, much more so than is today, or that we would probably want. Without taking away from your point that I think students do have to bear more of the responsibility for the cost of their education.
Just speaking to the general area of looking to other sectors for financing, and I think that's probably what the colleges and universities are going to have to do in the future. Is that the responsibility now of the population in general, the corporations, the alumni, now to try and help pick up some of the slack?
Yes, I would agree with that. We all have to face the situation together, and if there's a cutback, we all have to do the best we can with that. And I would agree that we all have to look at this, and if there are worthy students being denied an education, something should be done about it. When you mention loans, though, there's one big factor with these student loans, that there are millions upon millions of dollars that are not being paid back. And if this money was paid back, there would be more money available for the present students.
Right, you're absolutely right, and that's why you need a revamping of the system.
That's right.
Which is happening 2 years after.
Yeah,
so,
we all agree
yeah, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say the loan system is perfect, but the government is saying that the loan system is ensuring that accessibility where it currently isn't, because people who are qualified aren't getting those loans, and people who don't need the money are getting them.
Are you liable
I
to...
wish it was that easy.
Yeah, I was just wondering, particularly from the university's point of view, are you liable to, is this liable only to be the first hit? I'm thinking if research institutions are having funds cut, if municipalities are having the transfer payment cuts, they may not be as willing to pass along funds to the university. How many hits in together, do you have any concept of how badly you'll hit altogether yet?
Well, you're absolutely right. For the universities, the big area where we're also feeling a hit at Western is because we have such a large medical school and biomedical research group. We've always relied on the health sector for a lot of our funding indirectly, and of course that's going to compound the problem. I also think that we would be complacent to think that the announcements we're going to hear next week will be the end of the story, at least if the government moves on in the direction that they're thinking about. They're intent on funding not only cuts that will address the deficit, but also, and I think they should be rethinking this, cuts that will also fund a massive reduction in personal income tax. That's going to be a lot to bear in a very short time for this province.
With that tax cut, do you think that that's going
Inquiry, bringing people and issues together. Join us again next week.